Good morning. Hope you're having a great day. I feel a little bit intimidated this morning because yesterday Tony did his devotion, I think, from a boat. It was like listening to Jesus and teach from the Sea of Galilee. And I don't know, I'm just in my office, so I don't know how I can compare with that. But I can't, so we'll just dive into the passage and see what we see there. Today, I think the big question is, why does a preacher preach? Why do preachers preach? Uh, why is that a vocation? Um, I would have to say that in my case, it was probably the one thing in the world that I told God I didn't want to do. I remember that in the church I grew up in, there was always this idea of surrendering to full-time service, and there was always a call to surrender to full-time service, and I felt a call to full-time service, but I didn't want to preach. To be honest with you, I thought preachers were a little weird. And I wanted to be normal. And so I told God I'd teach physical education or do something else, but I just didn't want to preach. And then shortly after I went into the ministry, that was kind of reinforced. I remember I met a guy who I was renting our first house when we got to where our first church was. And the guy who rented it to me said, "Oh, yeah, my dad was in the racket for many years, and his dad was a preacher, and he called it being in the racket." You know, for some people, preaching seems like to be an ideal vocation. You know, you just work on Sundays and you get paid, and, that's, you get 6 days a week off. Well, I hope you know that's not the way it really works, but it seemed like this guy thought it was. And I just kind of don't like that picture. And so I didn't want to be in that category. I'll tell you the reason I preach. And I know this is true of Don, and I think anyone who really is God's person, this is what happens. God put a call on my life. It wasn't something I sought. It was a burden that began in my heart and then was confirmed through His Word and a lot of other things. I still remember a very specific time when I encountered with God, and that's what God told me to do. And it was hard to make that decision. It was not a decision I wanted to make, and it was hard for my wife for me to make that decision. So there was a lot of pain. And, if you have been called to preach, really, it's impossible to do anything else. That's what Paul says in this passage. Woe is me if I preach not the gospel. Before he gets there, he talks about, that they that preach the gospel should live by the gospel. So it's good and right to pay the preacher, but the preacher really never works for the congregation. Yes, the congregation can let us go, and the elders can decide, hey, that we're no longer going to be employed by this local church. But ultimately, our call comes from God, and He's the only one who can hire us, and He's the only one who can fire us. So ministry, not in a particular place, but ministry overall, is something that God calls us to. And I feel like Paul, woe is me if I preach not the gospel. To be honest with you, there's times I wanted to quit. I remember when things got really rough in the church I was in Florida, and I just wanted to just stop. I just wanted not to preach anymore. And I couldn't. I just knew that wasn't God's will for me. So I kept praying they'd fire me, and that way it would be their fault, not mine. You see, there's something when God calls you that is inside of you that isn't satisfied doing anything else. The prophet Jeremiah had that experience. I mean, he had a really hard ministry and felt almost like God had deceived him. And he said, I just decided I'm not going to preach any longer. But then he talked about in Jeremiah 29 that his word was like a fire within me, and I kept trying to hold it in, and I just couldn't do that any longer. That's the way the call of God works in a person's life if they've been called to be in ministry. And I've certainly felt that, and I'm sure that Don has felt that. It's an inner compulsion that motivates us to do this. And there are tough times, but I got to tell you that it has also been the most rewarding thing I've ever done. I have no regrets. I am so blessed to have been able to be in ministry all these years. And there's something that is really unique. I can't tell you how God sometimes uses people who are so unlikely, people like me, no great background. I'm the first one in my family to even go to college, and yet God has chosen to use me in some cases. So, when a person who is called by God stands up and opens the Word of God, What God does then is miraculous. It's supernatural. Lives are actually changed. I hope your life has been changed that way. I pray that you've had some preachers in your life that have really affected you in a positive way and that have helped you in your walk with God. And I pray that even as you do this devotion today, you'll be motivated to seek Him and to find His will for you and to do it today. So God bless you. Have a wonderful afternoon.